I think the most important trend we're currently observing in humanitarian action that can really be associated to geopolitical changes is the emergence of what many people define as new actors or non-traditional actors. I would like to call these actors rising global actors. These are not new players, these are not new actors. They're simply actors who have a new aspiration to be actors on the global stage. That includes a number of emerging economies in middle income countries such as the BRICS, or regional organizations like ASEAN, the OIC, and others, which are increasingly setting up humanitarian departments to organize a response that is led by them. This is accompanied by another trend we observe, which is a reassertion of sovereignty on the side of many states, and there are many reasons for that. I think particularly middle-income countries are clearly developing greater domestic capacities, for emergency preparedness and response, which means that they're less reliant on international assistance. But I think states are also increasingly cautious about their sovereignty, especially because there is a perception that humanitarian agencies often bring with them some sort of baggage in terms of carrying the political objectives of their donors, in a system that is seen as essentially Western or backed by the West, and which brings with it not just the politics of the West, but also a set of principles, for instance, related to gender, transparency, or participatory governance that is not necessarily welcome, in a range of countries where humanitarian crises occur. The fact that this is at the same time in parallel with another trend that we see in the West, which is accompanied to the politics around the global war on terror and the imposition of the counter-terror legislation and the implications that this legislation has for the way humanitarian organizations can operate and the impact it has in the way they engage with beneficiaries and partners in a range of contexts, reinforces these perceptions. So what we're seeing really is this emergence of players that come with their own ideas and their own approaches, and a difficulty in understanding how we can engage with actors that they don't necessarily want to be part of a system that has been long established with rules that have been largely set in Europe and for Western actors. The history of humanitarian action we're most familiar with is the history of the formal sector, which also reflects the formal architecture of humanitarian response. But this is actually very far away from the whole picture of humanitarian action, both today and in the past. So I think it is important when we think about the architecture to consider the history that has informed the way in which this architecture of emergency response has emerged. The formal system, the Western system, if you want, has its roots in the beginnings of the Red Cross movement, in the establishment of the UN agencies, and of course, its forerunners in the League of Nations and in the creation of Western NGOs. So when reading through the texts, which are included in the reading packs, I think it's important that you reflect on the impact that this history has had in the development of this architecture, as well as in the type of transformative changes that have been attempted over the last decade, for instance, the cluster system. At the same time, though, keep in mind the multiple histories of humanitarian action. For instance, humanitarian action in the Arab world, which is, has strong links in the tradition of zakat, or Chinese humanitarianism, grounded in the Confucian ideas of state responsibility and legitimacy. These histories and the evolution of ideas have actually had a strong impact on how humanitarian action is carried out today outside of the formal architecture. So the current architecture is actually not very well set up to recognize this variety of forms of response that are informed by different values and traditions. And this is why actually rising global actors are reluctant to engage with existing multilateral systems that organize the way in which humanitarian response is conducted, mainly the mechanism envisaged by Resolution 46/182 of 1991. Instead, what we see is rising global actors, a number of different actors, wanted to set up their own mechanisms and approaches to respond to humanitarian crisis. And this is because the current architecture is seen as inadequate, bureaucratic, cumbersome, and cost-ineffective. And this is not new, it's issues with which the sector has grappled for decades. The current architecture also faces criticism, of short-termism and, being fragmented because of the lack of coherent action and, an agreed long-term strategy between multiple actors, especially when crises are of protracted nature. And we know that protracted crises are actually the norm more than the exception. Part of the problem is also the lack of flexibility of the sector, of the international architecture of the sector. For instance, in recognizing and working with new players. We've seen in the Syria crisis, for instance, the role that the diaspora organizations have played, and the difficulty that both donors and more established international organizations, both UN and NGOs, have had in engaging with the actors that was felt did not have the required professional standards, or were not, if you want, assessed as being able to be recipient of grants, by donors or international organizations, and so in the end, the sector, the various international organizations and the donors lost valuable time in trying to find partners that met the criteria, instead of thinking how these partners could be supported properly, so that the response could be sort of more agile and flexible, and responding to the context that was so challenging. Many partnerships are in essence subcontracting agreements between international organizations and more local or even international but emerging players with less experience on a global stage. Now, there is nothing wrong with subcontracting agreements, but it's important that these partnerships become more meaningful, more genuine, and the sort of local partners, which is often in the front line, is acknowledged for the role it plays, contributes to defining the response, and is given a greater say in how the response is put together. There is really a need, to assess the response for what it is. The role of well-established international organizations, Western organizations, and UN agencies is, not to be done away with. But because of the increasing challenge of different contexts, we need to move away from a one-size-fits-all response, and we need to, really make sure that the response varies depending on the complexity of the needs and the constraints. So we need to be more flexible in using, partners that may be less experienced, but can play a role in those contexts. If we don't seriously invest as a sector in reshaping these partnerships and the architecture that structures humanitarian response, I think there is a risk that the formal system as currently known will become increasingly irrelevant when crises emerge, and will not be able to actually participate in the reshaping of humanitarian action that is already taking place on the ground. The four humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence have long guided humanitarian action. Whilst they've not always been respected, they are largely uncontested in the traditional humanitarian system. But I guess in today's changing landscape of humanitarian action, we really need to ask whether these core principles are still essential and relevant for humanitarian action, and how they coexist with different values and traditions. I think it's also important to think, whether there really is an operational role for the principles, particularly in terms of, seeking to gain access or acceptance, or whether, these are more values that inform the spirit of humanitarian action. I guess a useful way to think about it is to perhaps break down the four principles into what the really core fundamental principles are, which is humanity and impartiality, and to be reminded that independence and neutrality exist as tools to achieve humanitarian to provide humanitarian assistance and protection. They're a means to an end. They're not core principles in themselves. Interestingly, at a conference that we recently organized with the ICRC on the role the rising global actors are playing, one important emerging donor raised the issue that Western players almost like to purport themselves as the custodians of the principles. And he said very strongly, please drop the copyright on humanitarian principles and look at humanitarian principles for what they are. Humanity and impartiality, we all agree, we all converge. There is no actor that is involved in providing assistance and protection that would dispute that humanity should not be at the center of what we do, and that aid should be provided in an impartial way. That means on the basis of need and need alone. But neutrality, the challenge was, we non-Western actors are not neutral, and new Western actors are not neutral. And that obviously goes for states, but the challenge was further. The challenge was also to humanitarian organizations that are seen as closely associated with the donors, and by default having lost their ability to be seen as neutral and independent actors. Now, some players, the ICRC being one of them, will always make sure that the neutrality is a tool that they will never give up and be at the heart of the way they seek assistance and seek access and acceptance. But that is not the same for everyone, and different actors can use those principles in a different way, as long as humanity and impartiality remain at the center of what we do. Now, if that is, if you would, commonly accepted, it's also possible to look at points of similarity with different traditions. ICRC has already done this work in terms of finding points of commonality with Islamic law, and there is work done in terms of the traditions in Southeast Asia, Buddhist traditions, Confucian tradition, and so forth. I think that becomes a way in which the multiplicity of players can find a greater common ground. The vast majority of humanitarian spending goes to recurrent and protracted crises. About 80% of humanitarian spending goes to crises that continue year on year, in the same context. That, of course, it clashes with the type of very short-term emergency-based architecture of action that we have. I think the interconnectedness of risks associated with natural disasters, conflict and insecurity, and extreme poverty is increasingly recognized. And the protracted nature of most crises is also increasingly accepted. But what we see is that finance and response continue to be organized in silos, and we see a lot of, if you want, classification of a situation into components which range from emergency relief to post-conflict recovery or early recovery, instability, fragility, and so on. Now, the resilience agenda has helped understand both the nature of many crises and the typology of response that is required in a more holistic way that really brings together the strength of a longer term response to crisis where vulnerability is protracted in nature. But what we see is the concept is not being fully operationalized, and while some donors have made strides towards developing the response in a different way, the majority of actors continues to be working in a binary way between the emergency and the development side. Obviously, over the last decade, we've seen a rise of cash based programming, which again helps in terms of giving people greater choice in the response. But again, this is not a response that is appropriate in every context, and more work still needs to be done to operationalize that too. The key thing is really making sure that the response is really based on a proper analysis of each local context, the conflict dynamics, the political backdrop of a crisis. Ultimately, also for the resilience agenda to be genuine to its aspirations and guiding principles, what needs to happen is a proper analysis of the power dynamics that generate the vulnerability of people, because that's the only way you can address that vulnerability. And these power dynamics, these forces that affect the resilience of people will change context by context, and even within the same context, depending on the household unit, the family, the community, and so forth. So the essence of it is really rethinking of how we can bring aid in a way that is appropriate to each specific situation, without a predetermined response on the basis of priorities that are set on the basis of a humanitarian sort of funding fashion or a political priority in a set country, but responses that really are centered into an in-depth analysis of the vulnerability on the ground and how the different actors can be helped to overcome the power structures that create that situation.